Great. Well, let me welcome you to this American Enterprise Institute event on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021. My name is Rick Geddes. I'm a non-resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm also a professor in the new Jeb E. Brooks School of Public Policy at Cornell University, and also a professor of economics at Cornell University. And it's really wonderful to be here for this important event. I want to express my thanks to the American Enterprise Institute for making this event go forward, particularly to John Toohey and Macy Heath, and also for the support that American Enterprise Institute has given me over many years, starting back to the early 1990s, I believe, when I got a call from one Chris DeMuth, who was the president of AEI at that time, to produce a series of reports on postal reform, postal service reform, which were then converted into several peer-reviewed papers. I was teaching at Fordham in the Bronx in the economics department at that time, but was always more interested in public policy than abstract economic theory. And the job at Cornell came along in 2002. And that series of papers that were commissioned by American Enterprise many decades ago now were instrumental in me being able to move into that position, and now with the new Jeb Brooks School having a position in the School of Public Policy. So I'm very, very grateful to American Enterprise for the support over time and for supporting this event. It's been an honor to be affiliated. To provide a little bit of background, on November 15th, 2021, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act into law that we'll call the IIJA, and it was followed a vote in the U.S. House of Representatives that was 228 to 206, so bipartisan in the House. It passed the Senate in August 10th of that year on a 69 to 30 vote. It's a bipartisan act and very large. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provides $973 billion over 5 years from fiscal year 22 through fiscal year 26. It includes $550 billion in new investments for transportation, water, power and energy, environmental remediation, public lands, broadband, and resilience. Importantly, it also includes a number of important policy reforms in our area of public policy. One is that it helps to encourage more public-private sector participation or cooperation by raising the cap on something called private activity bonds, which help to level the public-private sector playing field from $15 billion to $30 billion through the U.S. Treasury. It has a provision in the bill that calls for a national mileage-based user fee pilot program, moving in the direction of road pricing, which is something we'll talk about later. It also includes reforms like the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, environmental permitting, which is a very, very important part of delivering any type of heavy civil or social infrastructure, and we can discuss those reforms. So I've invited a person who can get just as excited about infrastructure as I can, Adie from Brookings, to be our keynote, and we've known each other for a number of years now in this space. Adie is a senior fellow at Brookings Metro, where he leads the Metropolitan Infrastructure Initiative. He's an expert in infrastructure policy and urban economics with a particular focus on transportation and digital technology issues. Tomer's work has received coverage and citations in international print publications and other media outlets, including The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, The Washington Post, National Public Radio, and BBC. Tomer's testified in front of the United States Congress about the future of American infrastructure and has advised staffs of presidential candidates. He leads a team whose work aims to better understand how infrastructure policies from the federal through the local level impact economic development, social prosperity, and environmental resilience. So Adie, I'm going to turn it over to you to give us the outline and your thoughts on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
You got it. Thanks, Rick. And can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. I flew in today for this, and I forgot how hot it is in DC this time of year, so I hope everyone is doing okay with the heat and the environment.
We don't feel sorry for you.
Okay. Yeah, I hear you. It's been a really exciting time for infrastructure. Jeff and I, who've known each other for years and years, and you'll hear more from Jeff in a little bit. There's times when it's tough to tell people what you work on. You tend to have to say like, oh, I deal with congestion on roads or something, or people are like, oh yeah, why is my internet slow? But really the past 12 plus months, and I'm purposely dating that, prior to even the bill's passage, we were getting above, I'm dating myself here, getting above the fold treatment or, top of the newspapers, right? Talking about infrastructure. And that's been a really exciting moment. But in many ways, what we're living through right now is the actual tough work, which is implementing not just federal law, but in particular, how that impacts the state and local areas that are by far the larger investors in infrastructure systems, in many ways, larger regulators, and if you will, kind of informally, lowercase d, deciders of what happens in their communities. So it's a really interesting moment in infrastructure. And if I can kind of leave you with anything, is this element that we tend to think anytime we're living through any live policy debates, what's going on in the economy, obviously, major news even just this week, right, on macro economic issues. But it feels like we're living in the here and now. But infrastructure programming and investment is actually all about the future. Fixed capital assets tend to not go away. They last for generations. And so, in fact, the actions we're taking today don't just have a long-standing structural impact on the places where we all live. They actually have an immediate impact on the legislative debates to come after it. So as we talk today, what I'm really fascinated about is, not just the kind of the news around infrastructure, right? And the excitement in theory. And I'm actually not even really that excited about the physical stuff. This is the real trick when you talk to infrastructure people, is it turns out they probably preferred playing with Legos than actually hanging out with their friends, right? So those are not the people who should probably be driving prosperity and making big decisions. So what I want to say is infrastructure is really not about the stuff we build. If you can notice, there's something missing from all these pictures, which is it's really about people. And that sounds so hackneyed and maybe even cheesy, but I can't emphasize how much more important that is, right? The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is really about getting people to work, both in the short term during construction and long-term operations jobs, right? It's making sure that there is no student in America who does not have a digital connection in their classroom, because no matter where we are on the ideological spectrum, we want to see shared prosperity, right, for everyone, and equal opportunity. We want people to be able to safely play in their front yards and feel safe walking along any street, right? And we want people to have all the goods they need to have a block party, right? Infrastructure does all that, but we don't move stuff around or move ones and zeros around just for the fun of it. So I think this is the question I want to kind of, that'll kind of permeate through everything I'm talking about here. How do we actually seize this generational opportunity to deliver a more prosperous future? I'm going to go through kind of three parts. I'll try to be as fast as I can, mostly because I'm more curious to both talk with Rick and hear from my colleagues. But you can see what's on the screen. I want to start with what's in the bill. It's basically $500 billion in new spending. And that's effectively, depending on the sectors, what we're basically saying is over baseline. You can see the bulk of that new spending is in transportation. Transportation was already by far the largest federal program in infrastructure. And if it's not clear on this kind of page, these are not hyper-defined sectors. We tend to divide them in 4 groups to make it easy. But in general, we're talking about transportation, water resources, which I include the natural environment there, energy, and increasingly broadband, which I'm saying is not all of telecommunications. We're not talking about cable television here. We're talking about, again, moving ones and zeros. Now, why we've been saying this is a historic bill is that, in fact, as a share of GDP, just for federal infrastructure programs, this should exceed the New Deal once you stack in additional spending. Now, some of this, when we were projecting it, this would have been Build Back Better. But the reality is more and more of the ARP, at least it's $350 billion plus, because there's extra money in it, will go towards infrastructure. So we're going to probably get close to the New Deal percentage. And of course, the New Deal is something we still talk about in vague terms, of course, for a whole bunch of reasons, good and bad, on the programs it's left us with. But part of it was infrastructure. So when you hear people say, yeah, is it historic? Yeah, it's a historic bill. This was a big increase, although I think you're going to hear some fascinating data from Jeff when he talks about just how historic it may actually end up being. Now, so what's in the bill, right? I'm going to kind of click through these kind of quick. I don't need to read what's on the screen. You can read it for yourself. Again, reminder that transportation is just massive. Now, the numbers look different. That's because this is the total spending in the bill, not just what's new, right? So this is the aggregate. Our totals pencil out to just north of $850 billion. I have not found anyone yet who can make it be worth $1 trillion. So I think the media got in front of themselves and now doesn't feel like issuing an apology. So it's not $1 trillion bill, but it's a lot closer to $1 trillion than zero, if you will. So give them that. So you can see what's on the screen in transportation. Rick already started to get on this. There's a ton of new programs. There's also a bunch of innovative rules here too, right? All of the presentation and materials that we make at Brookings always become freely available. I think AEI is pretty similar, right? So why I'm kind of going quick, I'll go through all of these. I'm trying to give everyone just enough chance to read it. Now, part of what's happened in the bill too, which I'm not going to get into exact specifics, you may have heard things like, especially on water, that we are going to remove or remediate all lead pipes in America. But this bill actually took a massive haircut, anywhere from 25 to 33% in some of these program areas. I don't know any program or some hidden efficiencies where you can cut 25% of spending yet still hit your target, right? So I just want to stress, this is a lot of money on drinking and wastewater in particular. We are not going to get rid of every lead pipe in the country, partially because we cut the funding for it. Broadband also got a big haircut, even though the big capital program is still worth $42.5 billion. We are not going to come out of this in 5+ years, I say plus because whenever the construction's done connected to it, and suddenly everyone in America has a high-speed internet connection in their neighborhood available to them, even if they can afford it. That's just not where we're going to be. So there is still going to be significant work to do. Of course, Rick got at some of this too. The bill does more than just capital spending too, right? It invests in research and development programs. It has pockets of money to invest in workforce, and there are other kind of areas, in particular policy innovation. So it's not just a capital program, but let's be honest, this is mostly about capital spending going down to state and local actors. So how do we spend it? This is just meant to be an annoying slide. The reality is that we didn't really pay for it, right? We did this, right? Which is what we tend to do. We borrowed from the future. Now, for what it's worth, I want to be clear on this. I actually support this. Infrastructure creates long-run returns, right? That's where I started. So there is an idea of not just borrowing from the future, the people who will use the infrastructure tomorrow, in essence, can effectively be assigned a payment up front. It's a little parental, but it's basically how many countries around the world do their infrastructure investments. It's even how capital markets work for private sectors. Okay, so that's the kind of boring stuff. Let me get rid of that. Okay, what's it mean for the country? Folks ask about this kind of stuff all the time. Other folks that you will hear from after this are actually better experts than me on some of the processes here. But I want to emphasize, this is the general cadence. We're already, if you will, if I could put a circle, which would have been cheesy like in red, we're kind of in that darker blue arrow right now. So right, the formula funding got out very quick, really within, Jeff probably will know the quickest program, but it went out immediately. States knew what they were going to get, and they got their first tranche of money, right? Established competitive grant programs, many of them are already open for applications. Some of them have already...
Did you quickly define formula funding?
Oh, thank you. Gosh, I'm being way too long.
Sorry to interrupt. But
No. That's first of all, anyone is welcome to interrupt me. Anytime. So formula funding is effectively guaranteed funds that go directly, primarily to states, but not exclusively. So, for example, a state highway or Department of Transportation, and we'll hear more about that, right? They know exactly what they're going to get for certain parts of this bill. And by our calculations, 76% of that total $850+ billion is in formula funding. Now, the bulk of it goes to states. It's not exclusively. For example, transit agencies or public transportation across the country, they have much of their money comes through formula allocations. There's also other things they compete for. So the last tranche of this, and I really meant that, interrupt. If anyone has questions on technicalities, infrastructure people tend to gloss over them way too fast, and we don't want to use jargon if we don't have to. We're really starting to enter that kind of new program phase here, and there's a ton of new programming. By our count, well over 100 new programs. That's really hard, which, by the way, we're an extremely tight labor market. So the federal government is trying to expand employment right now. And as many of you in this room probably know, and streaming online, we didn't do a great job hiring people for the federal bureaucracy over the prior 4 years. So we actually need to staff up to help implement bills like this, where there is many of these federal programs are competitive. So the federal government really has to operate them. It's not like formula where they can rely on giving it directly to states. Okay, well, how does that spending flow? Well, think about it like this. It will feel slow until all of a sudden it starts feeling very, very fast. And the most recent experience we have on this is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or what used to just be called the stimulus until we did even more stimulus, right? So you can see first 6 months, we were only able to kind of dedicate the 9% of spending, but then by 18 months, it hit 50%. Now, different kind of era, different set of programs, but I just want to stress, even if things seem slow, before you know it, it will really start running. And I think we'll hear more about what kind of state departments of transportation are doing with this stuff right now. The other part of this is politics is going to be a big part of this in communities across the country. Whether it's decided by the Biden administration, which, by the way, because of the length of this bill, could be a different administration, both whether Democrat, by the way, or Republican, but in particular at that state formula level. So yes, states have guaranteed funding, but that tends to lead a tremendous amount of independent kind of jurisprudence, if you will, over where they spend their money. And that's a big deal, right? Because in DC, we tend to be very hands-off, but in the end of the day, someone's got to make a call when you're capital spending. A project has to go somewhere. So politics ends up playing a huge part in the infrastructure process. The other element of this, because so much of EJA is traditional, or what I would like to say to people is, EJA is not necessarily an innovative bill, it's a more bill. It does many of the things that we've traditionally done, just more of it. So what that's often going to mean, I think, is that we're going to see business as usual spending patterns. One of the most traditional things we've heard about, especially in the transportation space, which again, my colleagues after us will talk about, is, and I don't mean this to be rude the way I'm saying it, resuscitating zombie projects that didn't have funding before, and now suddenly, because there is more funding, they may be interested in now building them out, right? And so that's what I get. That's the most extreme example, but it's more than that. It's just making sure that maybe we continue to build housing and transportation in dangerous places. That's why the picture of Houston from the flooding in Harvey is on here, right? And I'll get to kind of why I'm bringing that up in a second. And the kind of last bit here is that we really have massive workforce needs on infrastructure. Mm-hmm. That's both inside the actual agencies that operate all of this. There's a lack of technical capacity, but it's also the number of people who work in the infrastructure systems, not just skilled trades on construction, but actually skilled trades for operation. So it's a massive part of the economy. EJA doesn't do nearly enough to help with the both recruitment, retention, and generally speaking, training for this massive workforce. And one quick thing while I'm on this, because a lot of people don't focus on infrastructure jobs, this is over 10% of the workforce, by the way. So all those people a lot of you probably work from home these days or tried to when you can. Those Amazon drivers and things when they walk up, that's an infrastructure worker, right? They are bringing a box to you. Infrastructure jobs have lower educational attainment requirements and pay higher than average wages. That is the most beautiful combination in America right now, and yet we are failing to invest in getting more people into these jobs. Okay, so that's what it kind of means for the country. I want to kind of focus on this last part here on what it means for local economies. So I want to start with a kind of quick story. By the way, this is the Katy Freeway in Houston, but no one would know what that is because that's a different indictment of America. No offense to some of my colleagues who are coming later, but this could be anywhere in America these days. The Katy Freeway was a massive project, one of the most expensive highway widenings in the country, I believe in the country's history, but I could be wrong about that. And it was effectively to help the suburban expansion of Houston. And by the way, Houston is a massive American success story. It's both building enough housing to keep housing costs low, something all of us who live in DC or have lived in DC know is a real problem. It's also been a growing job market, right? So there's been some really good things happening in Houston. But I want to be clear on how much the Katy Freeway expansion cost. $2.8 billion, okay? That's, again, there were other places they could have put housing. There were other projects they could have built. I have no problem with spending $2.8 billion on transportation. That's not my point, what I'm going to get at in a second. But this is an example of what our priorities were. Now, what's happened after the Katy Freeway expansion opened? And by the way, I kind of forgot the juice part of this. The day the Katy Freeway expansion opened up, it was immediately fully congested. So after they spent all that money for widening, there was obviously, and look, there's a lot of demand. I get it. And there's different solutions maybe to handling demand. But this is what I really want you to focus on priorities. The Texas freeze from not this past winter, but now, what are we, 18 months ago or so? Absolute, total tragedy, unavoidable. Two key numbers on here. 57 people died, and that was it at the time. I'm not sure if more people died. $130 billion in economic losses, right? It would have cost us $400 million to weatherize that grid, which, as some of you probably remember the news stories, from a decade prior, they had been warned inside the state, you need to weatherize because this freeze is going to happen again. I am not trying to point the fingers at Texas officials. It's certainly not a federal issue. It's not at local officials. This could have been any other state. Something is wrong in our system when this happens. There is no economic model, which probably a lot of us in the room either touch or like to cite, whatever, wherever you are, that would say this was a good idea. The freeway was congested the day it opened, right? There are real problems with our models. And when I say models, I mean it in this way. We talk too much in the infrastructure space. Remember that Lego thing I talked about? The what are we building? How are we building it? And not nearly enough time asking critical questions about why. Why are we building what we're building and where? What is animating our choices? Where are our moral imperatives in all this? And by the way, that is a nonpartisan or bipartisan issue, right? It's not just what we're leaving for our kids and all that kind of hackneyed stuff. It's who are we as a people? This isn't like healthcare where you use it in an emergency. What makes infrastructure cool, and oddly enough why you can talk to anyone about it at a cocktail party, as long as we keep our jargon out of it, right? is everyone uses it every day. Everyone has thoughts on how to design the roads better. I mean, how many people have you talked to about, hey, could we sync up the traffic lights better? Do you know how that works? No one knows how it works. They talk about it anyways, right? But we don't actually talk about the why and how it shapes our communities. I can't spend, that's a whole different event. So just want to stress, and I'm almost done here of what I'm getting at. To me, these are our 4 big motivating forces for the future, the 21st century in America, right? How are we going to manage climate change? Which, by the way, you should not be scared to say by phrase, right? It's really hot. And by the way, in the 1980s, we spent, in inflation-adjusted terms, $18 billion per year in extreme weather event damages. In the 2010s, it was $81 billion. The numbers flipped. On average, per year, inflation-adjusted. I don't care who's causing it, if we have to worry about that debate. It is a problem, right? And we've got to solve it. Many of you probably saw this recent reporting out of the New York Times and what's happening to Salt Lake in Utah, what's happening to the Colorado River. And this is really scary stuff. And I'm not sure when we're going to wake up, but to me, that's motivated by a why, right? We have technical solutions to all this. Digitalization, I just talked about it. 17 million American households, not people, households, do not have a broadband subscription of any kind. All of us in this room probably have wireless, and we probably have high-speed internet like cable at home too. And think about how often you use it. We're streaming this event, right? Workforce needs, I talked about it already. How do we give people good jobs? That's why I emphasize the differences. And finally, fiscal health. We're not talking nearly enough about how we make sure every community in America can invest in itself, right? Too often it's places like Los Angeles, Denver, Salt Lake, Charlotte that are able to invest in their built environment because they have either growing populations or big fiscal bases. What do we do with the St. Louis's, the Milwaukee's, right? Slower growth in especially older industrial communities. This is really important stuff. So 2 kind of last quick slides. So how do we actually deliver value? These are the kind of issues I tend to think about more often, right? So how do we set the right table? Are the right people around it? Or are we doing heavy-handed, top-down, disassociated choices of investments? Again, this is not, I'm talking local politics. I'm not talking partisan politics, right? How do we make sure people can have a voice? How do we stretch across jurisdictional lines? This is a global phenomenon that is a problem, especially in developed economies. We have an antiquated jurisdictional geography when cities were the limits of the place, right? But now, transportation, energy systems, broadband, they stretch far past those municipal borders. Yet we often see bad actions. This is not like Tebownian economics where vote with your feet. That's a good thing. I'm talking about systems that we all rely on that right now are not being designed in coordinated ways. And then finally, how do we think about the planning objectives we want to have? I talked about these zombie projects. They're going to be really few and far between, and we're going to do our best to not talk about them too much in our own writing. But I really do worry about people just taking their current project lists that were potentially as projects filled from the 1990s and 1980s that never got built. Are those reflective of where we want to be in the 21st century, or should we just rethink? I'm not saying spend less on transportation as an example. I'm saying spend wiser. Finally, what are those kind of key inputs, right? I talked about this. We need to have staff that knows how to manage grants. We need to make sure we have a workforce that can do all this work. And finally, and again, a preview of I think what Jeff will talk about a little bit, we need to have really fiscally prudent planning. Now, the inflationary environment changes things. This was what you're going to hear more about from Jeff. what does interest rates do to when you should potentially retire municipal debt, right? What's the situation? Too often, places do not do the kind of fiscal plan they should. And the biggest bugaboo of all for me is actually think about long-run maintenance of infrastructure at a local level. If you don't realize it, most often, the suburbanization of America, you know who pays for it? The people who already live in a community, right? They pay for the infrastructure to be built further out, and then it endlessly happens, right? I'm actually pro-suburbs. I live in one. I'm saying, how do we make sure that we build suburbs, cities, and everything in between and beyond in fiscally prudent ways? And that's really runs through infrastructure. So again, thanks for the time. Hopefully it's a bit of a primer on the bill. Obviously my own personal values more than spliced in, and really eager to talk more about it.
Terrific. Thanks, Adie. That's really great. Thank you for the overview. That's exactly what we need. I'm going to make a few remarks and perhaps some questions, but I urge everybody in the room here to think about questions based on that. There's also in the chat, John Toohey is going to be monitoring that. I'm going to try to keep track of people online who are asking questions. And your opening remarks sounded a lot like my first day of class, because I teach an infrastructure policy class. And it's an interesting world we're in, because I think traditionally it's been dominated by engineers. I love civil engineers. They're wonderful. I think they're trained to focus on the piece of infrastructure. That's right. The physical infrastructure, the bridge, the tunnel, the seaport, the airport. They want to make sure the bridge can hold a certain load and that it doesn't fall and that it lasts a certain amount of time. But to the social scientist, to the economist, what you said about people really resonates. And so I say focusing on the infrastructure itself is great, but focus on the value created, right? On the services provided by the infrastructure. Because to the economist, that's what people are willing to pay for, right? That's what they get. So I was a little concerned, I don't disagree, but you say the bill is more, right? There's more of what we've done before. But do you see anything in the bill that would help to address some of those issues? So maybe better project selection. Mm-hmm. So I was astounded by your Houston example, and of course the grid, the Texas grid. Cost, I had not heard that cost estimate is astounding, right? Is there anything either in the bill or what we could do in the future, that would help to address those things? So maybe we're going to have to address infrastructure holistically, because as soon as you encourage the use of electric vehicles, you integrate the transportation system with the electric power grid. So you're going to have to think about those systems as more integrated. But do you see anything in the bill, first with improved project selection? Starting with that. That'll kind of move us in that direction and maybe integrate, well, let's take that one and then go from there.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's not one answer to it.
Okay.
It really depends on what jurisdictional level you're talking about. So when it comes to states, this is the more part of the bill. For the most part, now look, any bill this big, you can find an exception to everything, right? There's little nooks and crannies of all kinds of stuff. But in general, what we found was that because there's so much traditional formula spending, it really leaves enormous jurisdiction to the states to decide how they want to spend money within their borders. And by the way, that's a good thing. That's American governance, at its essence. But what that often means is if we see projects that have federal dollars tied to it, that all of us all of a sudden say, oh, well, why did state X build that, right? And that, by the way, it may not be a bad project, just something you disagree with. Right. In the end of the day, we want to point our finger at the federal government, but it's really not the feds, right? They're just helping to make this spending happen. So there's not a ton of controls on differently than there were before, on what the states will do. We might talk about permitting a little bit. There's some other federal ways they always touch their dollars. Now, at the federal level for those competitive grants, though, there is definitely a different set of pursuits in many of these programs. One of the examples that's talked about the most in the infrastructure sector are two of them, quote unquote raise grants, which are older grants that got kind of repurposed, and they tend to do every 4 years when there's a new administration, and they can. But then also these protect grants, which both has a formula and a competitive component. And protect effectively stands for environmental resilience, whatever all those words are. theoretically, that should lead to different kind of project selection. There is also a range of programs. DOT, Department of Transportation, by far got the most new programs. So they have quite a bit that they can work on, everything from environmental resilience to people-focused designs and safer streets. So what I would leave you and everyone else with, I'd love to hear your thoughts, is because we're still using the lab of American democracy, we're going to see a lot of different kinds of projects based on the states. And it's going to be really important on, I say all of us, most of you don't have to do anything on this, but for folks like us who monitor this, to report out, hey, what worked and what didn't, based on those different states, rather than saying, hey, it's hands off. Because I think we continue to have this problem in America of questioning, why even have a federal infrastructure program if you're just going to recycle money back to the states? I've actually always had a problem with this. Senator Mike Lee has talked about this, and I think he makes a great point of, if you're just going to send it back, well, why are we doing this at all?
Just do a block grant or something.
Yeah, or not even that. Just don't send it. Why is there an administrative takedown in D.C., right? And I think Mike Lee's wrong, but he's right to ask that question, and until someone can answer it, the answer to that question is the justification for the program. The other side is we're going to need to monitor what the feds do with those, the bureaucrats do with those competitive grants, if they deliver new kinds of value.
Great. So again, to show my appreciation for civil engineers, one of my favorite groups is the American Society of Civil Engineers. And they, as many of us follow, produce a quadrennial report card. And I love that because it brings attention to America's infrastructure problems before the bridge collapses, which is the time to do it. And as we all know, they document the amount of deferred maintenance that there is across sectors on U.S. infrastructure. So we have this problem. And maybe it's cultural, I don't know, where we're good at building shiny new things, but we're not that good at taking care of what has been bequeathed to us. And that varies across sectors. Something like freight rail is pretty well maintained. Other things like bridges maybe are not. So one question I would have for you, Adie, is, this is a big spend. I think we all agree. Are there reasons to think a few years down the road we won't be in the same situation again? I think the ASCE says we got about $1 trillion of deferred maintenance backlog. And as we all know, you defer maintenance a little bit, and then it becomes much, much more expensive to correct that in the future. So I've been thinking about policy correctives, that might help to reduce the backlog of deferred maintenance over the long term. But do you see the bill doing that? Or do you think a decade or 15 years from now we'll be back in the same hole?
Yeah, it's a great question. My gut is, and I can't speak to ASCE's grading and what would influence it in the future. What I can say is I'm confident in the, let's call it like the human constructed portion of the water sector. So not rivers and streams, if you will, but that we are going to see improved assets there. The way that programming works, so these are through state revolving funds, they're called, which both typically make the state gets granted money by the federal government, then they loan it out to water utilities. This program has returned much closer to what we had prior to the Reagan era, which is really, it's actually on Congress, not President Reagan, but where they pulled back grants and switched to this loaning setup. Now through this act, the state revolving funds can give out basically zero interest loans, which is a grant by any other name, right? So I am confident, and there is so much focused money on, in particular, lead pipe remediation. So I think we're going to see less lead pipes in America. That is a massive form of getting rid of deferred maintenance. On the highway side, I'm honestly a little bit more skeptical, but not in a way that actually has anything to do with the state highway departments, if you will. I am fairly confident that they will continue to invest in their assets. What I'm really getting at is, for the most part, this bill does not allow money to go down to local streets. Now, the vast majority of miles traveled in America are on kind of what we call primary arterials, which is a wonky way of saying bigger roads. That includes both highways, 4-lane roads that you probably know from your hometown. Many of those are either state or county designated roads. And of course, U.S. Noted highways. Those can get the federal money very easily. But local roads, which have by far the worst pavement conditions, do not tend to see federal money. And that's my concern, right? Is that, in other words, that all of a sudden we're going to say, well, the road quality for many people has not necessarily improved. We'll still be able to look at pavement conditions and see that they haven't improved, especially on local roads. And we'll blame the federal government, and frankly, even blame the states potentially. But that won't be pointing the finger in the right place. if anything, it should be pointed at legislators on the Hill who have effectively, aren't investing in that, right? So I really worry about where I'm confident where each is targeted, it's going to probably improve the overall maintenance backlog or reduce it, right? But each, as big, as wide as that cannon is, it can't hit every target. And that's where my concerns are more.
Okay. Unless somebody hears a question. Yeah, yes, sir.
Hi, Mario Loyola.
Here's a mic.
Mario Loyola, Competitive Enterprise Institute. I was at the Council on Environmental Quality during the Trump administration and was one of the people working on the NEPA reform. And one thing that I like to tell people at the time is that with the risks, delays, uncertainties, burdens of complying with NEPA to get any permit that you need from the federal government creates basically Bolivian levels of risk for private without the advantage you have in Bolivia, which is that you can bribe government officials to expedite things. And that's a problem because there really is, I don't see, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see the limiting factor on infrastructure as money because there's a infinity of capital in the private economy if the risks were commensurate with the return on investment and the regulatory framework was right. Right now, we have a commitment by the Biden administration to a clean energy transition that would require maybe 1,000, 1,500 utility-scale solar projects to be built in the next 15 years. I would be astonished if they get 1/10 of the permits that they need. Right now, Southern Nevada District Office of BLM is overwhelmed by 2 permit applications, totally tied up for years by 2 or 3 permit applications, and they're suddenly facing a tsunami of 15 permit applications. Yeah. They can't do it unless you quintuple the bureaucracy. So can you talk a little bit, and I noticed we were hoping for expansion of FAST Act or something in the infrastructure bill, codification of one federal decision. Yeah. What can we do to untie all the red tape that's really going to be constricting not just infrastructure generally, but even a clean energy transition?
Yeah, it's a great question,
Can I suggest take it in 2 parts? First, NEPA.
Well, you might want to speak. You should speak to this. It's more of your lane. Yeah.
No, yeah. But I'm happy to give my thoughts. But anyway, NEPA's National Environmental Policy Act of 1970, and it's been added to over the years just to provide some definitions. And we have some data. I'm doing a paper on this using CEQ data. It's about 4.3 years, I think, from the initial filing to the ROD, the Record of Decision. I'm sorry?
And 7 years.
Because our data set was general 7, so it's even worse in transportation. Adds a lot to the cost. The second piece is the public-private partnership or private capital piece. So if you could take NEPA first.
Yeah. Great comment and question too, but thank you for the context. And thanks for working on this. This one's really tricky. And as you probably saw when you were up there, right? It's actually, for folks who don't know, this is super bipartisan. No one likes a project delay. So the fact that the current results suck, I think technically is the term for it. We got to do something about it. I'm sure Ezra Klein is a major VIP around here at AEI, right? But I'm saying even he's writing about it right now, right? What you had within 7 days or so was Ezra Klein talking about it, and then George Will talking about it, basically. So that tells you when it's really time to work on something. Ezra Klein, the New York Times op-ed writer. Look, dude, if I had the solution, this would be really easy. You were working in it, it's really, really tricky. And there are some good motivations for it. My 2 cents is we need a new NEPA. I think folks continue to try to I'm a big believer, when you try to work on the margins, maybe this is the Lego builder in me, but when you try to work on the margins on something that functionally is not working, maybe just scrap it. Yeah. That was written for a different era. For a different era, as much as I say this as a non-lawyer, so I might be wrong, but what sounds like a different kind of era of just how lawyering was done in America and what people sought it for. That's why I really appreciate, as folks in DC area know, the example from Chevy Chase on the Purple Line, right? This is not limited to just folks wanting to run roughshod right on projects through estuaries. These are good projects that are super inclusive being blocked and slowed down. It's slowing down housing. I don't mean projects like in a public housing sense, like housing construction projects all over coastal markets that are really expensive. It's a nightmare. And I'm not sure what else we can do besides getting rid of it.
But what
The
about-
one part
I'm
I
gonna
quickly,
push you.
really quickly
We
add,
brought up one federal decision. What do you think of one federal decision?
my point is actually more of the only reason we need those kind of Band-Aids is because we're forcing really smart people to try to work within these stupid confines. I think it just needs a new law. What I would add to the law that's missing, and I think what also slows down a lot of good projects, is NEPA does a really I'm not saying it does a good job measuring cost, it does almost a non-existent job measuring certain kinds of benefits. So it really makes it hard to argue, hey, this is a good project, we need it now. Here's all the bad things happening, here's what good will happen. But that still doesn't solve the problem of the current system allows, 1,000-page documents that are really about risk avoidance, right? And that's just not the right way to run a country, To the capital markets bit, which I'll speak to really quick, you're absolutely right. If anyone hears this, right, or ever thinks we're short on money in America, we never are on just about anything, at least right now, for the foreseeable future. I don't mean that in a fear-mongering way. We got more than enough capital. We see this in our telecom and energy markets. They have plenty, I'm saying privately owned infrastructure, they move capital, no problem. This is why you constantly have high-speed wireless internet, right? There are countries that are faster than ours. We are quite good in this country. We're good to go. We'll continue to invest. The problem with private markets that are underregulated, when it's a natural monopoly, is that you tend to get pockets of where people have nothing, especially if they have lower income. So how do we find that balancing act to move capital fast, but still make sure it can bring everyone along, especially on infrastructure, where it really is a platform for opportunity for everyone. So the law could do a little bit better on getting private kind of money into and private equity into infrastructure markets, but I'm actually not worried about how much we build in America. I think we actually spend plenty. It's back to that why question I ended with. I actually think we spend a lot of money on really dumb stuff. So I think I use sucks, stupid, and dumb in this answer, which says in a good way you struck a chord, and I'm even more honest. It's like that Katy Freeway example. They maybe still could have widened that highway, sure. That's a waste of money. It's a waste of money. Houston was going to grow anyways. They could have put people somewhere else. They could have put people in a much safer spot, in terms of the natural kind of wetlands that they're in. It was a dumb project, and it was a dumb project because they could get away with it, right? And that's putting aside the securing the power grid. So that's my thought more is I actually think our capital markets, the $4 trillion muni land, you wouldn't draw it up from scratch like that. It works beautifully, right? So that's not the problem. The problem is getting it to the right places. And I think our market signals are off, which is a totally different conversation.
Yeah, so
I hope that's your point.
Let me extend it a little bit because I did a monograph 10 years ago on private investment in U.S. transportation for AEI. And so I like this issue that in this world, it's a term of art, is a public-private partnership or a PPP. And what does that mean? Well, one thing it means is bundling these delivery elements together. So design and construction along with O&M, operation and maintenance, over a long time period. The stuff we're talking about lasts a long time. It could be 25 or 30 years, but including an F for financing in that. If you bundle the whole thing together into a DBFOM delivery contract, I think you can lower the deferred maintenance. That's kind of pushing on how we could adopt sound policy changes that would not get us in the same hole 15 years down the road. There's also the question of transferring this very risky, everything you do in this world is risky, in the infrastructure world, transferring some of that to the private investors. And it's a long-term partnership or relationship between the public sector asset owner, all this stuff is owned by some government, and the private sector. So do you see the bill doing much or anything? Because let's face it, our neighbors to the north, Canada, are one of the world's leaders in public-private partnerships. I could go around the world, the Australians, Spain, France, and so the Brits. Do you see the bill moving the United States more in the direction of benefiting from public-private collaboration, at the same time preserving the public interest, like you said, not having pockets, not exploiting monopoly power, and so forth? What are your thoughts?
If I had to make a guess, I would think that we are going to see less P3s in this environment.
Less, okay.
Less, because I think for good, and I don't think this is the right motivations, I just think it's why it happens. The public sector tends to come to P3s when they're looking for projects that they aren't willing to fully fund themselves.
Okay.
And this environment, I think, makes it more attractive to them to not do that. I'm not saying that's the right reasons or not, in fact. That's just my prediction, is that when public spending goes up, they're good to go, right? If you can go to capital markets, but for yourself, then you're going to do that, especially if you have reduced, your paper is cheaper, than the private sector. If you don't have that profit delta that the private sector should have. I do worry, though, because we don't run, especially our transportation systems, like utilities. We allow ourselves to build the wrong stuff. So there are some real assets to working with a private sector mentality, if not outright more with the private sector. But look, every infrastructure project in America is a public-private partnership on some level, right? They don't employ most of the...
It's all contracting.
Yeah, that's right. It's just a question of what you want to contract, right? And I think in the future, we can continue to get better at it. I don't know how much this bill is going to push us towards it, though, personally.
Let me shift to something else. Maybe it's a little more hopeful in the bill. We mentioned EVs. There's a big push. All you have to do is look at the Super Bowl ads, the number of electric vehicles advertised at halftime to see where things are going. And I know this bill includes a lot of funding for EV charging stations, so the chicken or the egg sort of problem. How much effect do you see the bill having in terms of a movement to electric vehicles, and do you see policy problems with that, or what do you see the benefit cost on that being?
Yeah, the honest answer, having read quite a bit of the published research here, is we don't know. I think we have different confidence intervals based on different people. Range anxiety, supposedly, which if everyone knows, that's the idea of you're running out of power in your car, same as if you run out of gas. It's supposedly a real thing among consumer sentiment, but then the vast majority of people, if they own their own electric vehicle, will just charge at home. So and they theoretically are going to be closer to their gas station more often than they are now. So and by the way, the bill has very little, effectively no, states can do certain things with it and localities, but there's really no money for that. It's money for public charging stations, effectively, or installing them in places where multiple people can access it, not a heavy installation in your garage. And that's electrical terminology, right? So my point is, I don't think it's this bill that's going to be the big factor here.
Okay.
I think it's going to be much more extraneous factors, like, of course, the unit costs of gasoline, right? The Federal Reserve, collecting a compendium of research. Obviously our gas demand is relatively inelastic, but it's not as inelastic as we thought even about a decade ago. In fact, the research that we used to cite had it at, I'm going to be wonky for a second, like negative 0.05. The Federal Reserve now has it, I think, at negative 0.37. That's a big difference. And that's just in the short term. So in the long term, how much are people sensitive to the price of gasoline? And right now, unlike the last time we had a really potentially sustained bad oil prices, I'm not sure if that's where we're going, people just drove less, or they combined trips, carpooling was up. Today, now there's a new technological intervention, right? And depending on what happens with inflation, but if goods inflation looks like it's going to continue to trend down, even while services inflation is up, is it possible that EVs could become cheaper, especially with economies of scale and production? What I'm getting at is I think it's going to be more about attitudes towards the environment, attitudes towards pricing, and then what actually the vehicles cost. That's going to end up impacting the market much more so. Now, the federal government, $20 billion, that's not the total EV investment. Let's say that's where we end up in 7 years or 8 years or something. That's well worth it if it juices that market. As much as we probably do too much driving, not probably, I'm being nice while I'm here. We are doing way too much driving in America, and that's a different conversation. And I own 2 cars. I'm not an anti-car person. It's just we drive way too much. It's really bad for the environment. We should be driving less, but we're not magically just going to get out of cars in America. We've spent almost 100 years building out an automobile-oriented landscape. We need to get around in it still. And we really need to do that in a climate-sensitive era. And EVs are the natural solution. So the quicker we can get people into that, the quicker we can start to make a dent in the highest, single source of GHG emissions that the country has.
Yeah, great. I have to, talking about wonking out, this is my personal bugaboo. Section 111 of Title 23 of the United States Code prohibits states from developing rest stops on the interstate highway system. So if anybody pulls off a rest stop in the middle of the night on the interstate, and you wonder why they have a few maps and vending machines. There's no restaurant there. There's no gas. That's kind of scary. It's Section 111 of Title 23. And I've always thought a good thing in the bill would be to relax that and allow EV charging at interstate highway rest stops, allow it to be commercialized in general. But anyway,
Yeah.
that's really my one thing. I'm going to end, and then we only have a minute left. I'm going to ask
quick.
you about the Buy American provisions in the Act, and give us your reaction unless there's a pressing question, and give us that, and then we'll end. And thank you for your time.
Buy America inflates costs, and it's a question of if it's worth, the manufacturing capacity. What we have to constantly be asking ourselves as a people is what is it worth paying for? What I want to stress on that is we just saw this, and there's a different competitiveness bill going through Congress right now that I think it has bipartisan support, and it's really to boost domestic manufacturing in a lot of critical industries. There is an argument for having, especially a country as big as ours that is physically, geographically speaking, isolated. We're living in a isolated war right now that is impacting global markets, particularly on energy. And it's just a fresh reminder of how interconnected we are, and having redundancies has value. In as much as Buy America does that, we just have to balance out if it's worth it. It is very complicated. And I think, I think folks who do full-throated no or yes, right? There's a lot of nuance in this one.
Okay, good.
And the American federal, to close on this, the American federal dollar is big, and it is a major influential actor. So thinking about smart and in a nuanced way about how to use that is really important.
That's great. Adie came in and out from another city to attend this. So thank you very much for this terrific piece.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, everybody. Why don't we, let's get started with Section 2, Part B of our meeting today, which is the panel. And Adie did a great job of unpacking the bill for us. Now we're going to break it down, I think, a little bit more and get some different perspectives on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I should call it what it is, an act. It's now law. And I'm very grateful to our panelists for coming over and sharing their expertise and doing that. So why don't we start with Susan Howard from AASHTO. I'm very grateful to AASHTO, by the way. One of senior person Jung Lee is on my advisory board for my Cornell Infrastructure Policy Program. And Jung has been a terrific supporter and helper in many ways for many years now. And so he's suggested Susan come to talk about the act. And Susan Howard serves as Director of Policy and Government Relations at the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. That's AASHTO, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan association representing transportation departments in the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. She works to advance AASHTO's federal legislative and policy efforts and serves as a key liaison between AASHTO and Congress, the United States Department of Transportation, and other national organizations. Susan previously held the position of Program Director for Transportation Finance and Program Manager for Freight at AASHTO. Prior to joining AASHTO in 2018, she worked as Director of Government Relations for the National Association of Development Organizations. She also worked as the Federal Programs Coordinator for the North Carolina Department of Transportation and worked on Capitol Hill as a legislative assistant, responsible for transportation issues for a senior member of the House Appropriations Committee. And Susan's going to give us the State Department of Transportation plus Puerto Rico plus DC perspective on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So
Thanks,
take
Rick.
it away, Susan.
Thanks. Appreciate you inviting AASHTO to participate today. I really feel like I could just sit back and relax because Adie covered a lot of important things that we've been focused on. But certainly, I think, going into the bill, we have been working for 18 months or more on a reauthorization, strategy and reauthorization proposals. And so I like to think about this bill, IIJA, as sort of a surface transportation reauthorization plus. So more money, more programs, more different kinds of money. And that matters to us who are, overseeing, delivering of the program in the practitioner perspective. in terms of where the funding is coming from Highway Trust Fund revenue or from the general fund. So we have been excited, sometimes overwhelmed by everything in the bill and everything that needs attention, but I think we've gotten in a good place so far moving forward with implementation. And you know, as was referenced earlier, sort of like it's a slow ramp up, and then all of a sudden you're really firing on all cylinders and a lot's going on. So we did get a slow start because of the delay in the appropriations, finality of appropriations bill that was required before a lot of the funding can be coming straight to the state DOTs through formula programs, as mentioned previously. So I like to say that we're focused on 3 areas. Vision is number 1. We have this tremendous opportunity to make a generational investment in transportation infrastructure, and state DOTs are a huge part of that, and we have a responsibility to do it in a way that is transparent, that is well thought out, that responds to the moment and what we're being asked to deliver for the American people. 2 is organization. I think there's organizational challenges both at the federal level with the US DOT and administering all these programs, but also at our state level in terms of new programs, new opportunities, new roles and responsibilities. Electric vehicle charging is a perfect example of a new responsibility that's come to state DOTs through the IIJA. And 3rd is communication, making sure that we're telling the story of what infrastructure investment means to people's daily lives, what this bill means, what it can and can't do. And I think that's going to be a conversation that's with us for several years to come. So all in all, we are, I think every state DOT is kind of, putting their heads down and working really hard to get structures in place organizationally to meet the many opportunities that this bill provides. Because certainly some of it is just extra funding that would, kind of come into the program and be allocated to projects without a lot of focus. But there's a lot of new policy in the bill to get through. There are a lot of new programs, and that's certainly where our focus is as well on the policy side. We don't want to just think about the funding, even though it's important. We also want to think about the policy structure of the bill and what it will leverage down the road. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we'll do a Q&A amongst us all, or discussion. But why don't we go next to Jeff Davis. And from Eno, a group I've worked with for a long time, Robert Puentes and I have often served on panels together. And Jeff's work on the gory details of transportation infrastructure policy for many years has truly been beneficial. So Jeff Davis is a senior fellow with the Eno Center for Transportation. He is also editor of the Eno Transportation Weekly. Jeff came to Washington in 1988 to attend the American University and soon began working on Capitol Hill for the ranking minority member of the House Rules Committee. For 6 years, he worked on a variety of legislative, budget, process oversight, and parliamentary procedure issues. In January of 1996, Jeff joined a transportation consulting firm and worked extensively on the FAA, Amtrak, and surface transportation reauthorization laws between 1996 and 1998, as well as various appropriations bills. He founded his own research and consulting business in June 1988 and published Transportation Weekly, a news service covering federal transportation and public works from 1999 to 2014. He joined the Eno Center in January 2015. His work focuses on analysis of the federal transportation budget and the long-term trends in transportation funding and policy. So Jeff, take it away. Jeff has some PowerPoints for us. Please enlighten us.
Thank you very much, Rick. I also should mention that when I was in my mid-20s, starting at when I first got into transportation at that lobbying firm, a kid I worked with, Timothy J. Baruti, the son and grandson of the guys who built this place, I think. So so I've had a connection to AEI ever since then. Making sense of the IIJA, this was a very strangely put together bill. I don't think you could have a group of 10 senators hijack the entire, who aren't on the committees of jurisdiction for the most part, hijack the entire process and assemble their own bill in anything except an otherwise dysfunctional 50-50 Senate. It's just very, very strange the way this worked out. But some of it was normal. They took, Congress was going to have to do a regular highway trust fund reauthorization bill, whether they did a big infrastructure bill or not. and it was mostly taken off the shelf. They took the highway bill that the EPW committee had produced by unanimous basis in 2019, and the rail and safety bill from the Commerce Committee, didn't change a word of it. It just the Senate, if it's good enough for the Senate committee, it's good enough to be passed into law without amendment. Some little tinkering on transit, but it provided $383 billion of highway trust fund funding for highways and transit. And as you can see, it was a big boost, 29% average boost on highway funding, 38% for transit out of the highway trust fund. Big, but not unprecedented. The 2005 bill had about a similar size jump, at least on the highway side. So it was a big reauthorization, but that was what Congress was going to be doing anyway before the bipartisan group of 10 took over. It was also, they took a bipartisan Clean Water and Safe Drinking Water Act reauthorization. They emphasized lead pipes, already passed the Senate. They plugged that in there, no further change. And they took some other bills that had been percolating around on the electrical grid, mining site cleanup, brownfields, rural broadband, that Congress might have done on its own, even without a central reauthorization, infrastructure bill. They just, they took all of the various normal infrastructure bills that Congress might have done, threw them into one package, and made sure the House of Representatives had no input at all. But then, the really weird thing that makes this bill unique is that Division J at the end from the Appropriations Committees, $446 billion of advance appropriations from the general fund, most of which is tranched out over 5 years. That never happens. There hasn't been anything big and central like that since the New Deal, and they haven't ever gone more than 2 years of advance appropriations in the history of Congress. So this was very unusual, and this money was intended to be on top of whatever Congress was normally funding out of the annual appropriations process. So out of that 446 of advance money, 184 billion was for DOT, 78 billion was for EPA, and they run not only the clean water and safe drinking water grants, but also things like the electric school buses and some stuff like that, and a lot of the remediation. 62 billion of those advanced appropriations for NETA and the FCC on broadband, 62 for the power grid, and $25 billion for water resources projects of the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation, and then a bunch of odds and ends. So that was what was really weird about this, was that you had $446 billion of regular appropriations made up front up to 5 years in advance to fulfill a lot of these otherwise unfunded promises that most of your authorization bills have. And so just looking at DOT, you combine the trust fund contract authority, the blue columns, with the regular annual appropriations, the green columns, and that last little bit of advanced juju from IIJA, you can see how much of in terms of annual funding, how much more of a leap this is in fiscal 2022, the year we're in right now, than in the previous few years, because you had increases in the size of all three separate components of the DOT budget. It's a huge advance in total funding. But it's not evenly distributed. They do play modal favorites. You can see that adding up all the appropriations and all the funding together, the FAA got a 31% boost over last year because of the big airport funding in this bill. Highways got a 43% increase. Maritime got a 48% because of the port grant program. Mm-hmm. The safety modes got 53. Mass transit got a 58% increase. The Office of the Secretary, where a lot of these multimodal competitive grants are funded, got a 222% increase. And the Federal Railroad Administration's budget has increased 486% year over year, from $2.8 billion to $16.5 billion. And that's going to be maintained. And all these increases, those 2022 rates are for the most part going to be maintained for the next 5 years, guaranteed, until 2026. FAA will go up more because FAA also has 90% of the DOT employees, and the controller work agreement controls the raise they get every year. So if FAA will eventually go up by more of a margin than the rest of the modes because of the workforce issue. But the IIJ kind of had a couple different competing goals. On the one hand, it was stated by the president many times that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make a big contribution to building down the capital backlog of the state of good repair, fixing the crumbling infrastructure. If you heard it once, you heard it 100 times. Crumbling infrastructure, that means putting money towards state of good repair and repairing capital. And so you had the $40 billion for the bridge that just goes for bridges and nothing else, that states cannot transfer to anything else that the president insisted on. There's about $12 billion for state of good repair for mass transit, $22 billion for the Amtrak capital backlog, both Northeast Corridor and nationwide. The $25 billion for airports, that number didn't come from the Biden administration. That was an older the FAA had actually done an analysis a couple of years ago of what would it take to bring every airport up to capacity and code, and that was about what it was. And then the $62 billion for the power grid. That's attacking the capital backlog. But also, they want to be transformational change for the future to combat climate change and other things. So you have the electric vehicle stuff, and all that's in the bill for EVs is the $7.5 billion for charging stations, $5.6 billion for electric mass transit buses, and $5 billion for electric school buses. They decided the bipartisan group could not reach agreement on what to do about making the vehicles cheaper so people will buy them. And they postponed that until the reconciliation bill, Build Back Better, which is still stuck. So that may not ever happen. And we're not sure how quick the EV transformation is going to be if there's still a $12,000 premium for a lot, versus what's left of the compact cars that are made today. $36 billion for new passenger rail service between cities, and $62 billion for broadband. That's transformational change where the federal government really hasn't made much of a role before. So you've got two separate kind of goals: capital good repair and transformational change in the same bill. The problem is both goals are funded with that same one-time only injection of $446 billion in advance appropriations that runs out at the latest September 2026, which is fine for your once-in-a-generation state of good repair goal. But that's not enough money to do full transformational change. That's a starting point for transformational change. And so the big problem everyone has to think about is for the goals in the bill that were not just about one-time capital backlog, what happens in 2027 when the big money runs out? So that's something that everyone at every level of spending this needs to keep in mind all the time. It's easy to forget because everyone always wants that increase over what you got last year, and there ain't no money in 2027. So then I got into an issue of looking at timing. How long is it going to take for this IIJA money to actually be spent in terms of going out the door from the Treasury? And I was not able to figure this out until finally this week, someone in one of the committees in Congress sent me an alternate version of the Congressional Budget Office baseline. It's the 1,600-page PDF of spreadsheet that pulls out the IIJA stuff, the first 5 years only, and how long it spends out. So. And it matters for two reasons that I'll get into. So the programs that are very broadly based, that are mature, have been going for years. They are present in all 50 states. They're formula-based, and they've got experienced bureaucrats in the departments who are accustomed to putting the money out through long-standing procedures, and the recipients are accustomed to doing this as well. They're going to spin out pretty quickly normally. This is the highway program for IIJA, the $47 billion, whatever it is they got. You can see that blue horizontal line is the 5 years worth of advanced appropriations, 9.46 a year, I think. And then the green line is the cash going out the door at Treasury. And you can see that it's a pretty evenly distributed thing. Mm-hmm. All the money gets spent out of the Treasury by the end of 10 years. Similarly, the EPA water quality grants, those peak a little higher, but again, still they anticipate all the money going out the door from Treasury within 10 years. And then you got some programs that are slower because they're new. They're going to take people time to figure out how to spend the money properly within the confines of the law. And in many cases, they're going to be building a lot of greenfield projects that don't have permits yet. This is the National Infrastructure Investment, the mega projects and the RAISE grants together. And you can see that $12.5 billion provided by the IIJA. Only about 94% of that's going to be spent at the end of 10 years. And the rest is either going to be spent after that or lost in the wash. Because it's going to take, it takes the better part of a full year just to actually, get each year's applicants and select them, and then another year to negotiate the project agreement, and then, et cetera. So those take longer. Then some things are even slower than that. This is that money, that $22 billion, how much it was for the intercity passenger rail grants. So it's 7.2 a year for 5 years of new money. And CBO projects that only about 73% of that's actually going to get spent by 2032. So you're leaving this money out there for a long time because it's building new railroad lines between cities that we haven't done since the 1870s or 1880s in some instances, and no one really knows what to expect. And then there are programs where you have just run out of capacity there are not enough contractors that specialize in this kind of thing in the United States and not enough materials to to do it on time. This is that $11.9 billion the Corps of Engineers got for construction. About half of that is going to be for ports and inland waterways, and then the rest of it is for flood control and other kinds of coastal remediation. But you can see that there was like a 11.7 in the first year, and then 50 million in the next 2 years, and then it's out. They put all the money up front almost, but it's just slow spending. The CBO projects that only half of it is going to get spent out in 10 years. And that's clearly just a capacity issue. There are only so many dredging contractors, only so many dredging vessels, and only so many people that the Corps uses. But the Corps does not have the capacity to build a program bigger than that. So even if we'd given them $30 billion instead of 12, it wouldn't make a difference on the spending side. There's only so much can be spent. And I should add that the Corps of Engineers has a very famous project backlog. And even though we gave them $12 billion on the construction account to buy down this backlog in IIJA, the House passed a bill last week that would authorize a new project in Houston, the Hurricane Ike Dike, worth $19 billion in the federal share and 11 Texas share, a $30 billion project that just with that one authorization, they have more than added to all of the backlog that IIJA was supposed to buy down. To build the big flood wall to keep Galveston Bay and Texas, safe from climate change. So, again, that's an unfunded authorization that will have to be funded someday, but we've entirely more than added back all of the good work that IIJA did for the Corps of Engineers water backlog. Now, the spend out rate matters for two reasons. First of all, as Adie mentioned, that it's very important. You found agreement from people from various political philosophies that if you're going to go into debt, it actually makes sense to go into the government to take on debt when interest rates are near zero to build tangible things like infrastructure and state of good repair. It actually makes sense. Problem is, that's not the way the Treasury works. Treasury does not borrow the money when the bill is signed into law or when the money goes out to states to be obligated. Treasury does not buy the money until the cash goes out the door and they have to make sure they've got enough money to clear the check. So the cash goes out the door on the green line, not the blue line, and not when the bill is signed. And so just because interest rates were near zero when this bill was written last summer, and it would have made all the sense in the world to borrow $500 billion at zero, we're going to be borrowing a lot of this money 5 to 10 years from now. I don't know what the interest rate environment is going to be then. No one else does either. So, but we cannot be guaranteed that there will be a near zero interest rate environment when the bills for IIJA come due. And unfortunately, as Adie also mentioned, it's not all paid for. They said it was all paid for. Maybe 40% of the spending was paid for. So the rest of it, we're going to borrow when it's not. So there are two very good reasons why, in addition to just efficiency, why it's better to have programs spend out quickly than others. So in addition to the borrowing problem, the other problem is inflation. The longer the money takes to spend, the more inflation is going to eat away at it. And I've been doing some research on this. The cost of building an infrastructure project, those components that go into that, often historically have actually increased at a higher annual rate than your regular CPI, which is the standard inflation for consumer-based inflation that we see used most often. This was the 1970s. This was from 1970 to 1980. The common, the various smaller lines with the various excavation, asphalt, structural steel, Portland cement concrete, reinforcing steel, structural concrete components kept the Federal Highway Administration kept track of, and they put them all into and then you can see the big red line with dots is CPI. You can see that from beginning of decade to end, construction price inflation moved ahead of CPI, and then the dotted line is the total amount of outlays from federal, state, and local governments on highways. So the entire 1970s were a lost decade because the costs of building these infrastructure projects was significantly exceeded by the rate at which the components came up. Even since 2003, people ask, well, that Safety Lou bill in 2005 was big. What happened to that? Entirely eaten up by construction cost inflation. And this had more to do with when China was granted full WTO membership and started being able to buy steel and other construction projects in the open market. Steel in particular went nutso about 2003, 2004, and has never gotten right since. And so again, the dashed orange line is the highway construction cost as measured by the Federal Highway Administration in their index, and the blue line is highway construction spending by all levels of government in the U.S. You can see that still from 2003 to 2021, unable to keep pace. How bad is it right now? Well, we just got the numbers last week from FHWA. It's the calendar year 2021 average. The highway construction index was 7.3% over average 2020. But, inflation didn't start going until about halfway through last year, and 2020 was a weird COVID year. So fourth quarter over third quarter, which I think is probably the best measure here, was 3.6% times 4 is 14.2%. That was the annualized rate of highway component cost inflation the last 3 months of last year. A lot of it driven by asphalt, but not, also steel and also a lot of labor-oriented things. The people apparently aren't as willing to go stand there in the blazing heat and wave signs for the amount of money they used to be, et cetera. But if you want to go fourth quarter 2021 over fourth quarter 2020, 17.5%. That's probably unfair. So I'm going more with somewhere around the middle number. But 7.3%, even though the CY average is bad, because if you look at just the projection for federal highway spending under IIJA, it's going to go from where it was last year. It's going to take 6 years, I think, to peak in 2027. And if you take the dollar amount and of that peak year versus what we'd spent last year and divide it by 7, you get a 7.3% annual increase. So if you do 7.3% inflation of highway construction costs for 6 years running, you've eaten the entire increase in federal highway spending out of IIJA. Again, that's not the same across all modes because IIJA played favorites. You would have to have prices still have to go up. I don't know, something shocking to be able to eat up all of the money that the Federal Railroad Administration has, for example. But so that's what I worry about is inflation for the most part, and made worse by delays in getting money out the door. So,
Thank you, Jeff. Boy, that's thought-provoking and a terrific overview. So before we go to Q&A, Patrick Jones, who I've known since my days in the National Surface Transportation Policy and Revenue Study Commission. Only Congress can come up with a name. And there was another commission, too, on finance. Back in 2008, I think I've known. Patrick introduced me to a lot of these key ideas on road pricing, tolling, PPPs. We talked about this, and it brought me into a number of his events. So it's great to have him here at AEI at this event. So Patrick Jones is Executive Director and CEO of the International Bridge, Tunnel, and Turnpike Association. Since assuming this position in 2002, Patrick has built IBTTA into the principal advocate for toll finance transportation and the leader in producing high-quality educational experiences for toll industry professionals. Prior to IBTTA, Patrick held senior management positions at the American Trucking Associations, the American Public Transportation Association, and the Health Insurance Association of America. He's also a member of the Greater Washington Society of Association Executives. Patrick is a passionate speaker on a variety of topics, including transportation, innovation, and creativity. And he has a BA in political science from GW in Washington and an MBA from Marymount in Arlington. So Patrick, it's great to have you here. This is something we have not touched on, which is the user fee model that might be in the bill, and it's of enormous interest to economists and how we move away from a per gallon fee on gas and diesel to other models. So can you give us your thoughts on the act?
Thank you, Rick. It's great to be here, and it's great to be with Susan and Jeff as well. And I tip my hat to Adie for the presentation you gave earlier, and I love the emphasis you put on the why of why do we do these things? Why do we invest the money that we invest in the infrastructure, as opposed to focusing always on the what and the how? And it really gets to a moral question about how we perceive our role in society and what we want our world to look like in the future for our children. You mentioned, Rick, the interest of economists in the user pays principle. I feel like I'm surrounded by economists here. Can I see a show of hands? Who's an economist in this room? All right, well, not too many. I'm not an economist. I think of myself as a salesman. I'm selling an idea. Rick mentioned in my introduction that I worked for the American Trucking Associations and the Health Insurance Association of America, and I joke with friends that it seemed to me that having worked for the truckers and the health insurance industry, the logical progression for me would be to work for the Tobacco Institute or the National Rifle Association, but I chose tolling instead. So let me tell you just a little bit about my association. We are the worldwide association for the owners and operators of toll facilities. So think of the New Jersey Turnpike, the Golden Gate Bridge. Think of the 495 express lanes right out around the Beltway here in Washington, D.C. Anybody who owns or operates a toll facility is a member of IBTTA. We are international. We have members in 23 countries on all 6 continents. Here in the United States, IBTTA represents 130 different operators of toll facilities in 34 states that operate 358 distinct tolling facilities, whether they're road, bridge, or tunnel facilities, that cover 6,500 centerline miles and generate, in 2019, $22 billion a year in toll revenues. My members typically are not on the receiving end of federal funding. They might receive federal funding if, for instance, it's the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey or the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in San Francisco, where they've got transit interests, or maybe they're doing earthquake retrofits to their facilities, but typically they generate their own revenue. I want to return a moment to something Adie said earlier about the why and the moral imperative of what we do. And as he was speaking, I was thinking about the movie Dead Poets Society. You remember it's a private boys' school for high school-aged boys, and Robin Williams plays this wonderful, energetic, passionate poetry teacher. And he's taking the boys out into the hallway to look at a trophy cabinet or whatever, and he asks them, so what is it that you want to do with your lives? How do you want to spend your lives? And they offered things like, oh, I want to study the law, I want to go into medicine, I want to become an engineer. And his response was, boys, those are all noble pursuits, and they will help you have a good living. But poetry is what you live for. And that's the question that Adie put his finger on, is what is it that we are living for, and what kinds of decisions and choices are we making about our future? And I think that's what investment in infrastructure really has a lot to do with. And you showed pictures of people and not roads and bridges. Rick, you mentioned the National Surface Transportation Policy and Revenue Study Commission, and I want to put you into the Wayback Machine for just a minute. I want you to imagine that you are in a ballroom at the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Dallas, Texas in September of 2006. That's one of the occasions where I first encountered Rick, and IBTTA at the time was hosting the first field hearing of the National Surface Transportation Policy and Revenue Study Commission. There had been no field hearings before. There had been several meetings that took place in USDOT headquarters, in cramped offices and uncomfortable chairs, and we laid the table for the commission in a grand hotel and gave them nice cushy seats. And I say all of this because one of the major outcomes of that commission, or at least one of the recommendations of that commission, is something that I feel is very important in the EJA, the IIJA, and that is the emphasis on a national pilot for vehicle miles traveled or mileage-based user fees. And we may recall that that commission, back in when it issued its report in 2017, 2007, 15 years ago, its initial recommendation was, look, we should increase the federal fuel tax between 5 and 8 cents a gallon over the next 5 years, and then we should index it to inflation. We should put a special fee on transit fares, a little federal tax on transit fares. We should put a federal tax on intercity rail fares. We should do something with customs fees and dedicate them to freight, and all kinds of interesting little incremental things the commission recommended. And then they said, we think that the current funding model will serve us well, the fuel tax being the foundation of that, through about 2025. But after that, we've got to move to a mileage-based user fee system. And we've got to start moving now. And that commission report recommended that in the next authorization, Congress should establish a national VMT pilot program. So that would have been, what would that have been? MAP 21 or the FAST Act. It didn't happen then. It didn't happen then, but it did happen in this bill, in this act, where there's call for, or there's actually creation of a national VMT pilot program. We see this as extremely significant because for all the reasons everybody has been talking about, climate change, the movement to electric vehicles, the declining revenues from state and federal fuel taxes, we've got to find another way to provide revenue to support our transportation system. Mileage-based user fees, or what some people call road usage charging, is a way to go. And I'm a big believer in this because I see tolling, the implementation of a toll as a facility charge, as sort of the original road usage charge. And now, moving to a national VMT, or at least providing funds for state-level VMTs, this is a way to move in that direction, to provide for funding that isn't dependent upon carbon fuel. So I guess I would close by saying this is a really important issue for us. There are other things in the EJA that are of benefit to tolling. There's a congestion pricing program. There's a toll credit program. There's lots of programs to encourage the development of electric vehicle charging stations and helping states, localities, MPOs, et cetera, take advantage of that. But I think in the end, we return to the moral question that Adie has, and that is, why are we doing the things that we're doing? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? How is the world going to be a better place? And I'm concerned, one of my big concerns is that the EJA transfers so much money from the general treasury into the highway trust fund that we're losing the nexus to the user pays principle that has served this nation for centuries, if you consider toll roads, and for 100 years, considering the first fuel tax in 1919 in the state of Oregon. So I look forward to the questions and the discussion, and just delighted to be here.
Thank you, Patrick. That's terrific. We have a few minutes for discussion. Again, I urge anyone in the room to jump in with questions. I also online, if people can, and they can also enter questions online. But let me set the table a little bit. We'll start with Patrick and then just mix it up. So to set the table, I remember back in the days of the commission, right, talking about how the federal gas and diesel tax and the state gas and diesel taxes were unsustainable because you're taxing something that you're trying to discourage in terms of policy. So you're trying to encourage people to shift away from fossil fuels. At the same time, you're relying on a fossil fuel tax to pay for the infrastructure. So now, in this day and age, we see a big push towards electric vehicles, both the vehicles themselves and the charging stations. And we've seen a push with the corporate average fuel economy to make car engines more efficient. And of course, that has environmental benefits. But again, it works against the sustainability of the federal gas and diesel taxes. So back then, we could sort of see that this was going to go sideways in terms of the revenue. You needed some other sustainable source. The analogy that I heard with some other policy wonks was saying, we think smoking's not good for you, it's bad for you, and we need some money for a healthcare system. So let's fund our healthcare system with a tax on smoking. Well, wait a minute. Once you discourage smoking, the revenue for your healthcare is going to go away. So that's kind of what I thought about. But Patrick, can you give us a sense of the state of play? Where are we now? I remember Oregon. Oregon was the first state to have the dedicated, or as the British say, hypothecated state tax. I think I'm right about that.
Yes, hypothecated.
1919, off by 1 year. And now the same state is a leader in shifting, and we should be clear, it's not a new tax. It's instead of the state gas or diesel tax, and move toward a mileage-based user fee, or a RUC, a road usage charge. Can you tell us where those state level movements are, and what's the state of play? And the second part of the question is, what's the holdup? So I talk about this in class. There's an issue of equity or fairness. There's also privacy issues. Tell us your thoughts.
So, first of all, thank you for the question. There are multiple state-based pilot projects for road usage charging all across the country. There are some regional pilot programs. There's what was formerly called the I-95 Corridor Coalition. Now the Eastern Transportation Coalition has a regional pilot program for trucks and passenger vehicles. The RUC West, a collection of, I think, 14 states in the West, has a regional project. And then, of course, Oregon is a leader in this. Hawaii, Utah, Virginia, Connecticut are all either experimenting with pilots, or they have operational programs where they've got volunteers who are participating in this, and this is the way that they will pay their usage charge. I think that we've learned a huge amount from the state level pilot programs, and there are a series of regular concerns that come up when you talk about implementing a road usage charge or a distance-based fee. And they have to do with privacy, they have to do with urban versus rural, they have to do with equity and income levels and all those kinds of things. And what the provision in EJA provides or intends is that in this national level pilot, we will strive to address all of those issues, that we will have public outreach and lots of communication so people understand how we're going to address their privacy,
Equity.
equity, rural and urban, all of those different concerns.
Right. So quickly, what do you do about the argument that poor people have to commute farther, therefore they would pay more under road usage charge relative to, this is a crude urban model, relative to wealthier people who live near the city center?
Yeah, most of the studies have shown that people in rural areas will actually pay less under a road usage charging scheme because they're paying more now in fuel taxes, because if they're poor people and they live in rural areas, they're likely to have older, less well-maintained vehicles that get less fuel efficiency, so they're paying a higher fee now. If you're paying simply on the distance that you're traveling, it's going to be a little bit lower for people in rural areas.
Terrific. Thanks, Pat. Kristen?
I also want to say that I did the numbers again the other day. If you look at the cost of CAFE standards are only the measure of the MPG for the new cars sold that year. If you look at
Not the fleet.
not the fleet. The FHWA publishes annual average fleet for light duty vehicles, and so if you look back the last time the gas tax was raised in 1993, 18.4 cents a gallon was the equivalent with fleet-wide MPG then of about a 0.96 cent, just under a penny per mile. Usually was the equivalent, and because mileage has gotten better, higher to the point now that as of 2020, that was 0.80. So the actual, if the gas tax is a proxy for a per mile fee, that fee has been dropping every year, and then you get into doing the purchasing power, and once you combine it with that, it's gone down in nominal terms, and then down to about 20 cents in 1993, 0.2 cents in $1993 in terms of actual purchasing power. But I would add one thing that when we started having these discussions, and I was there in the room when you guys unveiled the report, and Shenendorf had briefed me on the
you
day
were there.
before and all that.
Boy, the memory machine, really. I think I remember you.
I just remember, because at the time, everyone thought that the major hurdles were privacy issues and technology / the cost of putting the boxes in the cars.
Yes, I remember that, yes.
I no longer believe those are the obstacles. The obstacle, I believe, is the IRS administration, because the fuel tax is extraordinarily effective for the IRS to administer. There are 1,300 points of taxation at the oil refineries and wholesalers, and with only a few dozen companies, at most 1,300 individual points of filing, paying estimated taxes twice a month, filing quarterlies. It doesn't take that much manpower for the IRS to pull in $30 billion a year from 1,300 points, and you're
that's
going
both gas and diesel.
Yeah, and you're going from 1,300 points of collection to 200 million points of collection, and I don't. And the Treasury has never, as far as I've seen, given a comprehensive briefing to Congress or anyone else as to exactly what it would take for them, in terms of manpower and money, to administer a tax like that. Particularly, my grandparents didn't drive for the last 10 years. They drove. They didn't file taxes because they didn't have any income. So, is the IRS going to chase down old people, or extremely poor people who doesn't make enough money to file just to get their $40 a year of VMT fee? I don't know. There are a lot of the main questions I see that are difficult now are on the IRS admin side, not on the privacy or tech side.
Patrick, what about the IRS tax collection issues?
Well, we talked earlier in your conversation with Adie, we talked about the federal role, and should we even be having a federal tax that's recirculated to the states? Maybe the solution is 50 state programs that they're figuring it out now.
Right.
So maybe it isn't a federal program ultimately.
Yeah. I once heard that they dye the diesel red at the point of taxation. The diesel fuel, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to confirm.
Well, it's chemically the same as a lot of other fuels until that point. You don't know whether it's diesel or... There's been a lot of leakage between jet fuel and diesel, and people stealing one and selling the other for different tax rates, and a lot of crime over the years with that.
Interesting. Well, let's, no pun intended, but shift gears a little bit. So I think I understand that the Federal Reserve raised interest rates 0.75 of a point recently, which in a normally conservative organization is a really big move. So so that would be the general question of what's separate from inflation, right? We all know that infrastructure projects, particularly greenfields, are debt heavy. They have to borrow in different debt markets. What do we think? Maybe Susan, I'll start with you. What do you think? Suppose we're in a new interest rate environment, right? I have students who said, I've only lived, my entire conscious life has been in a low interest rate environment where they're used to 2-3%, and that's it. And now we're kind of getting regression to the mean, I guess. But it's clearly a major move. So what do you think, Susan, in terms of the effects of higher interest rates on this? Separate from inflation, right, which is a little different, on the entire infrastructure delivery world and the effects of the act. And then I'll go to you, Jeff.
That's a great question. I think that I'll be interested to see how the extra revenue that this bill provides, particularly in the formula funding, like year to year, it's significant. But I don't think it's going to revolutionize any one state's program. So we're still going to rely on the mechanisms that the federal government provides us for bonding, for lending programs, for state infrastructure banks, all the various tools in the toolbox that are there. I think will still be leveraged, and probably even more so. Can the investment in IIJA kind of move the needle a little bit to provide more kind of a cushion or a safety sort of space for that type of thing? Again, a lot of our states are heavily, heavily bonded.
I know.
This comes up with RUC because many states are bonded against gas tax revenue, state gas tax revenue. So if we switched all of a sudden to a RUC, well, we still have bonds for 30 years that are based on
How long are the bonds?
30 years
30?
plus.
Okay.
So anyway, it's a complicated,
Financial,
one decision kind of sometimes has a ripple effect down the road.
Yeah, interesting. Jeff? Interest rate, suppose we're in the brave new world of higher equilibrium interest rates. How do you see that affecting your slides?
Well, on the one hand, not so much because whatever the federal interest rates are, the TIFIA program will still be the cheapest thing in town. They're just borrowing whatever the federal government's able to borrow at, and you add that tiny admin fee and turn it around and make a TIFIA loan. It's still going to be cost of capital cheaper than private borrowing. And then I'm not sure what this is going to do on the muni side.
I assume they'd follow the market.
You get that it winds up being a trade-off with whatever if Biden was going to Biden's taxing rich people. That makes a big difference to the muni market as well.
Yes,
because they're the ones that buy munis.
Right.
But I don't see it having that much of a difference, with the way that this bill is administered. Because again, if you're going to use any of the TIFIA in particular, TIFIA or RIF, it's still going to be the cheapest game in town. It's just the game has shifted, the entire
and
board.
same for RIF or WIFIA as well. Yeah.
Yeah, they're all going to take advantage of the ultimate borrowing capacity of the federal government. Again, unless this crisis ends somehow with the dollar no longer being the world reserve currency, in which case all bets are off. Right. But that's still a ways away, I think.
That's a different meeting. Patrick, what do you think about Susan's point regarding the gas and diesel tax revenue is bonded against way into the future and shifting to a RUC or an MBUF or VMT fee, whatever we want to would affect that?
It's a similar challenge to the situation you have when a politician or policymaker says, let's remove the tolls from this toll facility. Well, toll facilities carry a lot of debt, some of them, to carry on their capital programs and maintenance, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So if you eliminate the tolls, then you eliminate the revenue stream to pay off that debt. So I agree. You have to be careful about individual decisions that have cascading consequences.
Right. Thank you. The other, I have a bunch. Shall we shift to the railroad funding? Jeff, you said is passenger rail, right? Mm-hmm. So when somebody says rail, I have to think of Matt Rose was on the commission. We have to think of the freights, Class 1 freights, et cetera, as separate from passenger. So that's a huge increase. There's different ways of thinking about it. But do you see that as improving Amtrak? Do you see any policy changes? Anybody could weigh in on this? That might, because this is something, as an infrastructure person, you hear all the time. I go to Europe and they have such nice passenger rail in Europe. I come back to the United States and it's not quite the same quality. Why can't we, supposed to be an advanced industrial country, get our passenger rail up to snuff, particularly in dense corridors like the Northeast Corridor now goes down to Richmond up to Boston. And that's dense enough to at least cover the ongoing OPEX, operating expenses. So what do you think, Jeff?
As a good conservative, I have always felt that there was actually a much better argument for the federal government spending a ton of money to bring the Northeast Corridor up to code because unlike all the rest of this infrastructure, the federal government actually owns the Northeast Corridor.
CSX owns a little bit.
A little bit. But almost all of the D.C. to New York City part is owned by the federal government as they inherited in those terrible railroad bankruptcies when no one else could in the 1970s. And so it's always made much more sense for me for the federal government to take care of the assets it actually owns first before making grants to states to take care of assets that the state owns.
That's a good point.
And there's enough money in this bill to make a serious dent in a lot of the NEC backlog. I think they've got, out of the $36 billion competitive grant program for federal-state partnership for intercity passenger rail, I think they've a limit of no more than 24 can go to the Northeast Corridor.
Oh, really?
And they intend to, most of it intends to, and then there's also, I think, another $6 billion that Amtrak got directly for doing some of their projects. The the tunnel under the Hudson, the new tunnel will get built somehow. I'm not sure. We're still not quite sure which pot of money it's going to come
Is that
from.
the gateway?
Yeah.
That'll get built, yeah.
That they with Chuck Schumer as leader and Biden as president, they will find a way to find some form of money in this bill
Right.
to fund that before 2024. And there's a significant number of others. They're going to be able to shave another, hopefully, 20 minutes off the Penn Station to Union Station time with some of the money that's in it. Now, whether or not they want to spend this money doing aesthetics, the palatial Union Station and Penn Station train hall redesigns that are as much about the looks as they are about actually, passenger throughput.
Right.
That's a separate question. I'm not sure that so much of the old New York Penn Station in particular was that 80-foot beautiful stained glass ceiling, wherever they had back in the 1920s. Why can't we have that anymore? Well, because we have air conditioning now and fans, and it was grossly inefficient. But
Right.
So there is significant progress will be made on Northeast Corridor capital backlog on this. Unfortunately, Amtrak has used this as an excuse to move away from operational self-sufficiency and assume billion-dollar operating deficits in perpetuity. So their 5-year plan, they had reached operational break-even just before COVID, and then now it's $1 billion a year operating loss.
plug the hole.
As far as I can see. So that's a separate issue. But there was a lot that we can done in the Northeast Corridor, but I'm not sure. There's still not enough money, even if you gave it all to California for them to finish their phase one of their system. So there's
Put that to one side.
You could maybe do a couple of almost true bullet train pairs between cities like 180 miles apart with the rest of that money.
Yeah. Let's put Gateway to one side on the Northeast Corridor. I'm with you. I think that'll happen. Do you think they'll straighten out the right-of-way on
Connecticut?
on the Northeast Corridor? Because it bends and it twists, and I've heard enormous estimates on just getting the
In particular, between the Newark and Boston part.
Exactly.
I don't the real estate condemnation costs are so astronomical, and the NIMBY stuff. The people don't want to move their house.
Yeah, NIMBY's huge there. Okay, let's Susan. Let's show, again. Go back to EV charging stations.
Yeah.
And the money that Jeff showed in the
Yeah.
slides for EVs and this sort of national movement. How is that interacting with the state DOTs? How are they viewing? Because I always wonder, where are the charging stations going to be? Are they going to be in a parking lot? Are they going to, but state DOTs own a ton of this land, and I don't know if they would, tell me your thoughts on the interactions.
Well, so there's a real stepped-up role for state DOTs in this bill through the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, where states are going to get formula money to plan and build with partners EV charging stations. I mean, what's really being mapped out right now is within the framework of the alternate fuel corridors, which already exist on the map, and there's the NEVI program is pretty narrowly focused in terms of distance and proximity to the interstate. So it's really kind of getting that, like you said, sort of like the baseline network to address range anxiety, like was mentioned before. I think it's really been an interesting time. I mean, this is work that mostly has been done through state energy offices. Some DOTs have been quite involved. There was a Volkswagen settlement, and where funding from that went to states to work on building out EV charging. So we've had some states have been very involved, some states not as much. But why state DOTs do this work? Well, we know how to deliver projects, and we know how to work within Title 23. Honestly, could have given it to the energy folks, but they don't get the size and scope of federal dollars that state DOTs do. And we know procurement, but it's a different space for us, obviously, being in related to energy transmission. So states got, like I said, formula money through the NEVI program that they have to, it's contingent upon them completing and getting a state plan approved. That deadline is August 1. So it's been it's of anything coming out of the bill, that has been certainly had the momentum, I think, in terms of new programs and getting new structures in place at state DOTs to really meet the call to do this work.
Terrific. Let me throw to anyone on the panel who wants to hear this or address this. So some media folks, have this question. We all know labor markets are very tight, materials markets are even more tight. Is the bill inflationary? Will the spending in the bill contribute? So there's the question that Jeff mentioned of the effects of inflation on the bill. That's in his slides. Flip that around. Is the spending in the bill itself inflationary? And media folks say, is this like a really bad time to be doing this, right? I have my thoughts, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I defer to the economist.
Yeah,
Jeff, I know Jeff's going to take this. Jeff, is this
I
bill
don't think this
inflationary?
bill that is inflationary in the macro sense. I don't think it's going to affect CPI. There's sector-specific inflation,
Right.
and just there's only at any given time, so much, so much steel capacity, so much, some cement capacity, and particularly in combination with the Buy America stuff.
Yes.
I will say that the Buy America, I agree with what Adie said earlier, that it's sort of a social contract. It started off with maritime in 1919 and trying to figure out, how to preserve shipbuilding capacity for the next war. And it's a way of saying, okay, certain industrial jobs are so important to our society that every American should have to pay a little bit more to preserve those manufacturing jobs. As long as you look at it that, and then it started even with the steel industry in the 70s. But the way Buy America used to work with infrastructure, it was a different set of rules for every mode. FHWA had their own, motor carriers, the FAA, et cetera, because they had all come up about as riders on different bills at different times. Which it was confusing, but at least had the advantage that each set of rules had been worked out by the experts. Those have now been replaced by a uniform set of rules established under IIJA. And they had to, I remember I was when IIJA was going through, I was giving a talk in New Orleans to some ready-mix concrete people. And I got a call from Vulcan Materials that morning, apoplectic, because it was going to apply Buy America to gravel and rock. And I was happy to be giving a speech in New Orleans, and I was telling these people, call your congressman, because, no amount of good intentions from Congress can allow you to go 20 miles from New Orleans anywhere and dig a hole in the ground and get rocks out. They live in the damn swamp. And because of that, that there are certain issues that, where Buy America where God did not make it practical for Buy America.
Right.
Right. With places where there are no rocks in the ground. It must be brought in from somewhere, and getting it from barge from the Caribbean is far easier than getting it by truck from Central Texas or wherever. So they took construction materials in a certain sense out of the Buy America. But still, yeah, there are capacity issues in the contracting community where that you could have, depending on how quickly the contracts ramp up, a little sector-specific inflation caused by too much money chasing. We saw there's something happened in 1976 when the Budget Act came in and freed up decades of impounded highway money, and obligations went up like 70% in one quarter in 1976, and that caused a little run of sector-specific inflation. There's a paper on it somewhere out there. So it is possible that you will have sector-specific cost inflation from some of these vast funding increases, but I don't think it'll be enough to reflect in the national economy.
All right, we're almost just about out of time. One quick final question, everyone. What will the bill do to alleviate the supply chain crisis, the supply chain problems that we have? Like, should Americans in the future see this bill and say this spending, the added policies will ensure that this does not happen again in the future? And Susan, do you want to give us your thoughts?
Well, I think there's certainly been a lot of hopes pinned on maybe some of the discretionary programs to directly address some of our supply chain issues. There's structural, I guess my question is sort of like, where did our structures and institutions fail during the last 2 years that got us here, and what can we reasonably do to address that? You can make an argument that just like a seamless transportation network really, alleviates this problem. I'm not entirely convinced, because our system has gotten more complicated and complex. Our needs have changed. The way we're using delivery services has changed. The way we're getting goods and services has changed. So I don't know. I think that that will be a huge either selling point or missed opportunity coming out of IIJA, depending on how some of what we can actually tie to, tangible results.
Anybody?
I have 2 words,
Okay.
baby formula. I don't know what it says about the supply chain, but
Nothing
it says
good.
something about
Yeah.
unexpected things that we just can't anticipate.
Right. Jeff, I'll give you the last word.
I believe that the money that's being spent, that will be spent under this bill on container port expansion, port efficiency, intermodal transportation hubs, and harbor deepening on the Gulf Coast will have a significant effect on the trade side of supply chain stuff, especially container trade. By the time a lot of these projects get done, 7 to 9, 10 years from now. But it's not. There's no overnight.
There's magic switch.
Yeah, there's no overnight magic switch.
I think there's some wine and cheese outside, but let's thank our panelists first for coming over. Thank you, guys. Terrific. Thanks, everybody.